for a long time, I wished I was white. I downplayed the parts of me that weren't British. And she was a version of me that performed. She put on an act, she hid her culture, and she constantly tried to act British enough to belong. This gap between who I was and who I wished I could be is what psychologists call the self-discrepancy theory. Wholehearted living means I'm worthy now. So instead of burning out, trying to be your ideal or ought self, you build resilience by accepting the actual self. Welcome to Reflections and Realizations. I'm Alveena, a diary writer, a reader who's always connecting ideas, a master's student of psychology, and a believer. This podcast is my diary out loud. I'll be sharing notes from my studies, reflecting on my personal experiences, and exploring faith, all as a way of making sense of it all. And I'm inviting you along on the journey to reflect, process, and maybe, just maybe, see a bit of yourself here too. So I remember being in the playground at primary school, watching my friend's hair blowing in the wind, and I was transfixed at the sight. And I remember wishing I looked like her. I tried to do everything she did to be more like her. I would lie about what I had for dinner, pretending I'd eaten fish and chips just like she did. I'd try to watch the same shows as her. I even pretended that English was the only language I knew, just like her. But I could never be her. I was one of the few brown students at my school, and she was white. And it feels so strange to open up to this today, but for a long time, I wished I was white, just because being white just seemed easier. Because white girls didn't get bullied by the boys in year 6 who thought it was funny to prostrate in front of them in the playground. They didn't have anyone pinching their noses in disgust when they opened their lunchbox. And they didn't have loud Punjabi speaking grandmas picking them up from school. They just seemed to belong. And I remember feeling like this for such a long time until we moved to an area where more children looked like me. And for the first time, I realized what it felt like to belong somewhere. And it was in the food, it was in the language, the way we celebrated Eid. And for a while, I stopped wishing to be someone else until I moved to Egypt. Because in Egypt, I once again wished that I wasn't brown. Because at my new job, teaching at a British international school, I was told parents felt disappointed that their child's teacher wasn't British enough for their liking. So to them, in parent-teacher meetings, I downplayed the parts of me that weren't British. I spoke extensively about how my grandparents arrived in England in the 70s. I over-explained how I got my QTS, and I pretended that I could hardly speak Urdu. And it's only now, many years later, that I realize how deeply I disappointed myself. Now, I didn't have the knowledge to process all this back then, but now I do. That this feeling, this gap between who I was and who I wished I could be, is what psychologists call the self-discrepancy theory. Now, psychologists say that we carry 3 versions of ourselves. We have the actual self, who you are right now, the ideal self, who you wish you were, and the ought self, who you think you should be. And the bigger the gap or conflict between these selves, the harder life feels. And as a child and teen, I didn't know I was living with 3 versions of myself, but I felt the conflict. I just couldn't name it. So, for example, my actual self loved watching Top of the Pops and America's Next Top Model. She read Just 17 magazines and Sweet Valley High books, and she wasn't deep, she wasn't devout, and she really liked to dance. But my ideal self, this version I wished I could be, she woke up for her morning prayers without being nagged. She spoke fluent Urdu to her grandma on the phone. She was a girl who was comfortable in her skin, and she was a version of me I wished I could be, but never could quite reach. And then there was the ought self. She shouldn't be too loud. She shouldn't be too Muslim. She shouldn't be too brown, especially not at school and then later at work. And she was a version of me that performed. She put on an act, she polished her English, she hid her culture, and she didn't correct people when they mispronounced her name. And she constantly tried to act British enough to belong. And when those 3 selves clashed, it created a tension I couldn't understand at the time. And I thought I could escape this by growing up or by moving somewhere I'd finally belong. But I didn't realize that it had to come from within. So I learned in my last module that Higgins self discrepancy theory says that this inner conflict you feel comes from the gaps or mismatches between these versions of yourself. So it's like living with this constant internal critic who's comparing you to some impossible ideal or some checklist. And the bigger the mismatch, the stronger the negative emotions. So Brené Brown, who's a research professor who spent over 2 decades studying authenticity, she talks about this conflict and she says that this inner voice that says, you're not enough in this situation, is the fuel behind self discrepancy, the gap between who you are and who you think you should be. And she stresses the importance of wholehearted living, which means owning your story, believing you're worthy of love and belonging exactly as you are. And she doesn't just talk in theory, she gets real about what it means to live wholeheartedly. And she says that it's about choosing to show up as you are, even when you're afraid you'll be rejected. And I was thinking about this, and I thought that maybe that might look like, to me, correcting someone who mispronounces your name, even if it feels easier to stay quiet. Maybe that's saying no without apologizing because your worth isn't tied to pleasing others. And maybe that's choosing hobbies or interests that genuinely excite you, even if they don't fit the norm. In other words, I think wholehearted living means I'm worthy now, not when I lose the weight, not when I pray more regularly, not when I look like my friends, or not when I'm finally invited out to drinks after work, but now. So instead of burning out trying to be your ideal or ought self, you build resilience by accepting the actual self. Because Brené Brown says, and I quote, authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. In other words, our worth isn't about performing or meeting external standards. And I was thinking, if I view this through the lens of my faith, perhaps I can say that my relationship with faith has evolved over the years because I grew up with perpetual guilt. Because there was always this long list of things that I knew I ought to be doing, things that a friend was doing, a relative was doing, the neighbors were doing, and it weighed down on me. And I tried to implement it, then I'd fail, then I'd feel bad, and then I'd try and implement it again. And the cycle would continue. I think here's what I've come to realize, that every faith I've learnt about carries this truth, which is that it's not about the perfect outcome. It's the intention, right? It's the effort, it's the striving, because we all have things we ought to be doing, our responsibilities, our expectations, perhaps spiritual practices like prayer, charity, meditation, or service. And being true to yourself doesn't mean rejecting them all. I think it means recognizing that what matters most isn't about ticking every single box. It's the journey, it's the willingness, it's the sincerity, it's the effort to keep on showing up. And there's a prophetic saying in my own tradition, which is that actions are judged by intentions. And I think that truth carries across faiths, that it's the striving that counts. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've become, just because I've learned about it, I've become immune to the self discrepancy conflict, because I still notice it in most days. I still notice it. For example, when mothers around me talk about balancing work and family, and I wonder, should I have gone back to work? Or when gentle or mindful parenting comes up, and I think I ought to be better at this by now. And again, it's that subtle gap between who I think I should be, this ideal mother in my head, and who I actually am in reality. So, yeah, I still feel it in certain circles, but instead of letting it spiral, I try to ground myself into what I value in this life. And I constantly remind myself that I'm not them and they're not me. And I'm trying to practice this mindset as well. For example, living as an expat in a Muslim country, I'll still hear it sometimes at the school runs where someone will say, "Oh, I didn't know you were British." And I'll make the point to say, "Yes, I'm British Pakistani." And when I get mistaken for any other nationality, I correct them with, "Actually, I'm Pakistani." And I have to say that. I physically have to say that for my own sake, because it wasn't always like that. Because There was a time I used to feel proud of being mistaken for anything except Pakistani, because deep down, because of school and later work, I had internalized the lie that being Pakistani made me less than. And that's real life example of the self discrepancy conflict. And I'm working, I'm trying, I'm trying to embrace who I am. And I think recently I learned that I love that I can mix and match the different parts of my story. But the part that I'm most intentional about is raising children who don't have to hide parts of themselves, and they're not boxed into gender stereotypes or anything like that. For example, my son, he doesn't play football. Actually, he shuns most sports, but he's completely obsessed with theatre and performance. And my daughter, she dresses like a tomboy. God forbid she should ever wear a dress. And she can't get enough of football. And there are moments when others, kids or adults, try to tell them how they should behave or what they should like, but they don't shrink. They don't feel the need to deny who they are. And I love that for them, because I didn't have this level of security growing up. I thought I had to perform or behave in a certain way, but they don't, because I'm doing the work now. I'm learning to become secure in my identity. I'm learning to reconcile my actual self with the ought self so that they can feel secure in their actual selves. And sometimes I think this is what healing looks like. And not for them, but for me. So, if I bring this back to you with some journal prompts, have you ever felt like you've had to shrink parts of yourself to belong? Have you ever been caught between the conflict between being a working mom and a stay at home mom, and you feel guilty no matter which path you choose? Or perhaps at work, do you hesitate to speak up in meetings because you worry your ideas won't be taken seriously? Or in social situations, do you find yourself smiling and nodding to fit in when inside you're on a completely different page to everyone? So, if so, this journal tool is for you, and I call it From Shrinking to Secure. So, what you do is step one, you spot the gap between your actual and your ought self. So, what you do is you write it down. So, write down 3 truths about yourself that feel contradictory, the parts of you that might clash with what society, family, or even something that you think you should be doing. So, maybe that's I feel strongly about clean eating and eat fried chicken every week. Or I'm a believer and sometimes I have doubts about my faith. I care about social issues and sometimes I just read the tabloids. Or I listen to political podcasts and watch Love is Blind. Or I'm an introvert and I have a podcast. So if you say them out loud, you acknowledge them, you validate them, and it kind of turns it into a power, because you're recognizing your wholeness instead of shrinking to fit in with someone else's story. And then step 2, you realign with your true self. So you ask yourself, who am I when I'm not performing? Who am I when I stand before God and not the world? And once you know, this is your actual self, the one that isn't shaped by comparisons, expectations, or labels. It's a version of you that's whole and worth realigning with. So act from that place. Do the things that honor your faith, your roots, your identity, but on your terms. Because thinking back to that little girl wishing she was white, oh my God, I wish I could tell her that. One day you'll be raising children to be free, who are free to be exactly who they are. Children who don't hide parts of themselves to fit in. And through them, you'll realize that the freedom you give to them to be themselves is the same freedom you're learning to give to yourself. So I hope this podcast encourages you to reflect on your own journey and to notice the ways you're navigating the gaps between who you wish you could be and who you really are. Thank you for listening to Reflections and Realizations, and I'll see you in the next episode.